I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome to RealAg on the Weekend. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks a lot for joining me. Hope you had yourself a great week. It is great to be back here for another episode of RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM. Thank you so much for joining us. It is great to be here on Rolco Radio. We got another great show for you here today. A lot happened in the world of agriculture for sure, and we got a bit of a wrap up on that. We're going to talk weather. We've got Scott Kehler from Weatherlogics. We're going to hear what he thinks about the Western Canadian forecast here for the early part of spring as we try to make it a little bit more spring-like, although it does feel a little bit elusive. We're not really into spring, at least doesn't look, as we see some snow on the ground in parts of Saskatchewan. We're also going to hear today on RealAg on the Weekend some commentary on the wheat markets. I had a chance earlier this week to talk to Chip Flory, host of AgriTalk. AgriTalk is a big U.S. farm radio program. I happen to be on it in the U.S. and every Friday. It's a lot of fun. Chip's a very good friend. And we're going to talk about how some of the winter wheat conditions in Kansas and Oklahoma, for example, the ratings are very poor and what that could actually mean for the spring wheat market in Western Canada. We're also going to hit on the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index, the results for March. That's out of RealAgristudies. That's the market research arm for Real Agriculture. And then we're going to hear all about a new episode of the Canadian Ag Policy Connection podcast that my colleague Kelvin Hepner has been hosting. And this episode that dropped this week is all about the end of the single desk. And I know that there's going to be people in this audience that are like, best thing that ever happened. And there's going to be people in this audience saying, yeah, I wish we could take that one back. Well, I've got some data to look at on how Western Canadian farmers feel about that decision more than 10 years after. So we'll get to that here in a little bit. If you have any feedback on today's program, I would love to hear from you, whether you're listening in the tractor, the truck, or at home. You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms. Real Agriculture is on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as TikTok. Or you can call that RealAg feedback line. And here's the beauty. We don't even have to put you live on the air. You just call the number, press the number 3, and you leave me a message. 855-776-6147. As I mentioned earlier this week, I had a chance to talk to Scott Kehler from Weatherlogics. And we talked about the Western Canadian forecast. Here's what he had to say.
Well, spring started out different depending whether you're in the western prairies or the east. In the west, it was a fairly normal start where you had some warm temperatures early on, and it's cooled off a little bit more recently, but that's not too unusual. However, in the east, they had a deep snowpack through a lot of Saskatchewan into Manitoba, also in the northern U.S., and so things have been very slow to get going there. The month of March didn't even reach above freezing in Winnipeg, and now April's turned around completely, and the snow is almost gone in the Winnipeg area in a matter of days. So we're seeing kind of a big shift that way. As we go forward, I think the month will generally end up around normal for most areas, but that normal will be comprised of a lot of high temperatures on some days and much colder temperatures on others. So it'll be very up and down.
Yeah, well, we've been experiencing the up and down here in Alberta because Sunday, gorgeous. People are out golfing, courses are open. It's people are out in their back decks, having a cold one. And today it snowed again. So there's an up and down for you. So do you though expect from an air temperature standpoint, do you expect this kind of cool bias to continue into May, or is it going to be a situation where it's like, boom, it's like, where did spring go? It's already summer.
Well, it looks like the cool bias is going to linger a little bit longer into April than usual because of the deep snowpack. When you have a deep snowpack, that can cut easily 10 or 15 degrees off air temperatures versus what it otherwise might be. In Manitoba, for example, on Tuesday, had there been no snow, it would have been close to 30 degrees already, but the snow held things down into the mid-teens. As we get later into April, that snow will be gone, so that bias will be removed. Now, I don't think that for most areas, it's going to be a super dramatic shift to summer. However, it might feel that way in some cases, especially in a place like Alberta. If you go from snow one day to 30 the next day, that might feel very dramatic, but that's not as unusual. In Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they're probably going to go more like from mid-teens to 20s and then maybe to 30 in May.
What about precipitation? We had a much better growing season in 22 compared to 21. That's that's an understatement. But what are we expecting here for the early part of 23 when it comes to precipitation as we transition out of La Nina?
Well, the forecast we issued for the summer earlier this winter calls for a drier than normal growing season in the western prairies and a fairly normal growing season precipitation-wise in the east. However, the west will probably stay drier more generally across the growing season. At least that's our forecast now. Whereas the east, we're expecting to start a little bit wetter in the spring and then become drier as we move later into the summer. So that's a little bit similar to last year, although last year was extremely wet in the spring in the east and then got a little bit drier, or really not dry, but more normal come summertime.
We've got some ranchers in that southwestern corner, southeastern Alberta area that aren't going to like what you just told us, Scott.
I know. I've been hearing a lot of criticism of my forecast in the western prairies. They've been wanting rain for a long time, and the unfortunate thing is you're in a much drier climate to begin with, and then when you don't get rain, that just makes it much worse.
Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure we hit on. Well, actually, before I go forward, I want to ask you one more question about the prairies, and that is heat-wise. You mentioned the precipitation for air temperature for the summertime for the prairies. What are you expecting there?
So that follows a similar trend to precipitation. We're expecting that the western prairies will generally be a warmer growing season, and in the east, a more normal growing season in terms of temperature. But when I say normal, that's really an average of two different pieces of the season. So the spring will probably start cooler, and we've already seen that in the east, and then turn hotter as we get more into the summer. So the hotter summer and the cooler spring will balance out to be close to normal.
That was Scott Kehler with WeatherLogics. A bit of a carryover is sort of what I'm hearing there from Scott. A little bit of normal. And as I discussed there with Scott, what we really needed that southwestern corner of Saskatchewan is a change, right? So eastern Saskatchewan, if they got the same conditions that they did in 2022, probably happy. Northern Saskatchewan, same. But we're talking about the southwest corner. Yeah, that's where we need the change. That's where we need the flip. That's where everybody's really excited about the potential for La Nina going forward. I asked Scott about La Nina and how quickly we change. Here's what he said.
The other thing about the transition from one pattern to the other is that it's not something which you can always count on occurring every month of a growing season or every month when this is in place. So you'll have broad periods of time, let's say seasons or years, where you can sense that El Nino is playing a role, but other factors also come into play as well. El Nino only refers to the temperatures in the central Pacific Ocean, but the northern Pacific Ocean also plays a role in prairie climate. And so if its influence increases or decreases, that can affect our weather as well. So because the Central Pacific is a very, very large area, it's one of the more dominant factors that affects us. But remember that even if you're in an El Nino pattern, that doesn't mean that the weather can suddenly change to be a lot less El Nino-like for short periods of time before it goes back into that more prevailing pattern.
For so much of the Western Canadian prairies, really, quite frankly, a good part of the acres too in the United States, so dependent on weather. When you know what farmers would probably say, I don't care where you're farming, weather is the big wild card factor that really determines it. It either takes your decision making to make you look like a genius, or it takes your weather, there's nothing you can do about it. And obviously there's a lot in between there, but definitely hoping for a very, very good growing season in front of us here in 2023, and one we'll be following as we move on through the 2023 season that is here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk spring wheat markets with Chip Flory of AgriTalk. You're listening to Real Ag on the Weekend on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith of RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern for The Agronomists, Canada's only live, interactive, agronomy-based show. Each week, we answer your most pressing questions with a rotating panel of agronomists, researchers, and extension staff from across Canada. Join me Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, or head to realagriculture.com/live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Hey, I'm Kelvin Hepner, and I just wanted to give you a heads up about a new project that we are working on here at Real Agriculture together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI. We're calling it the Ag Policy Connection. Stay tuned. The first episodes of the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. They'll be showing up here on Real Agriculture and in your podcast feed on your podcast player shortly.
You're listening to Real Ag on the Weekend, hosted by Shaun Haney on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM. Earlier this week, I had a chance to catch up with Chip Flory. He's host of AgriTalk. Chip does a great job of analyzing the markets. And we talked about the wheat market, and he related what's happening in the winter wheat crop condition and how that may be a bit of a trigger to enable some better market conditions when it comes to spring wheat. Here's what Chip had to say.
The spring wheat market is as much up in the air as anything else. You talk about a market that's got to get all intended acres planted. You better be looking at spring wheat. The reason that I say that is because of the terrible condition of the HRW crop. Good grief. 28% graded good to excellent, 36% rated poor to very poor. That's the general numbers. But when you look at some of the conditions up in Kansas and the HRW acres in general, these crop ratings are historically low, historically bad, and we've got to find a way to replace some of that production that's going to be lost in HRW, and spring wheat's the best way to replace it. We need to get all 10.5 million acres planted, so that spring market's got to be engaged, and all the markets really have to be engaged in providing incentive to produce and get all intended acres planted. I just don't think there's any question about it. And wheat, if we had any kind of demand to go along with it in the export market, I think the market would just be on fire. You'd see that spring market in that 930, 940 range, trying to give incentive to get the crop in.
Yeah, well, that's the positive, though. There's something to look forward to there, definitely on that spring wheat market. It's going to be music to the ears of a lot of our viewers and listeners in Western Canada and in the Northern Plains, for sure. Finish up with the Ukraine-Russia grain deal. What do we make of this? Because everybody I talk to seems to have some sort of different opinion on the significance. We're hearing Russia may, decide to even pull out of the one that they just negotiated. There was a 60-day deal. Is this the end, Chip, of these grain deals, or is this just Russia talking a bunch of smack and just trying to get what they want, get these sanctions removed?
Yeah. My gut tells me that we're not going to see Russia participate in another grain deal. It's what my gut tells me, but we don't know. Nobody knows what Putin is going to do. That's one of the reasons that the wheat market is kind of as the anxiety level is as high as it is. And corn as well, because I just find it more than coincidental that Chinese President Xi visits Moscow, and after he leaves Moscow, we start hearing a different rhetoric coming out of Putin and Russia about this grain deal. And it just seems to me that without officially announcing that Russia and China have come to some sort of a trade agreement on grain. We haven't seen any official announcement, but it seems like they've come to some kind of an agreement on grain coming out of Russia, and Russia will get it one way or another. If it had, unless Ukraine is successful in pushing troops out, Russia will get the grain that it needs to ship to China one way or another. They'll either grow it or they'll take it. So that seems to be the direction that they're going on that. So, the U.S., Canada, I would throw Australia into it, but we've got, it looks like a pretty quick transition from La Nina to Enso neutral to El Nino. And the potential of El Nino scares the heck out of the Australian producers, as it should. I mean, it could turn into a pretty tough growing season for them in short order. So can't really rely on Australia a lot to move grain into China. But if I had the absolute right answer to what Russia is going to do with grain flow out of the Black Sea, we'd be ahead of the game. That's for sure. But,
also, call your options broker.
That's right.
And we're starting to see countries like Poland, I think, was one. Bloomberg's been kind of on this story where they're, farmers are starting to get mad about some of the imports of some of the Ukrainian grain. That's got to be concerning for Ukraine from a sentiment standpoint, as they need support from Europe, their European allies, never mind the U.S.
Yeah, and Kazakhstan has banned the import of Russian grain now. That was done because they don't want to be the middleman of Russian grain sales. So because there was a lot of grain that was flowing from Russia into Kazakhstan, and then Kazakhstan into the rest of the world, and then the money back into the Russian war machine. So they've banned the import of. Yeah, I keep going back to a panel that I moderated at Top Producer Summit. Steve Freed was on it, Matt Roberts was on it, and Ambassador Kip Tom was on it. We were just talking about global grain flows and how things would be changing in the year ahead. Those are three of the smartest guys that I know when it comes to talking about what the grain trade flows will look like in 2024, 2025. They didn't have an idea. They had an idea, but they weren't committed to their idea on it. So I think it's just kind of a go with the punches attitude on grain trade right now for wheat in particular, but corn you got to include in that as well.
That was a part of my discussion that I had with Chip Flory, host of AgriTalk. So possibly some good news there for spring wheat, although a lot kind of things very, very uncertain. What's very interesting when you think about some of these markets is what happens with this Ukraine-Russia grain deal. Russia sure is talking a tough game, basically saying, that, hey, listen, if you don't drop the sanctions on Russian grain and fertilizer, we're out of this deal. And I have read more and more geopolitical people talking about how this may be the last of these deals. And what are the consequences of that? Are G7 countries that have put these sanctions on, are they questioning whether they should have the sanctions? I'm not getting that feeling. Like if all of a sudden there's a press release on Monday morning saying, hey, guess what? Sanctions are over. I think people would be shocked, to be honest with you. And we'll see if Putin's bluffing, I think, is what sort of the talk is. And yeah, it's just a situation where, honestly, I was on a webinar earlier this week. I did it with Grain Fox, and Neil Townsend was one of the market analysts on there, as well as Randolph Glanville, and we also had Jacob Shapiro from Cognitive Investments. And Jacob just made the comment in terms of like when that war is over. He just said nobody knows, because the circle around, like, nobody knows what Putin's thinking. there's so many unknowns around all of that if anybody is like 100%, this is exactly what's going to happen. No, nobody knows. So you just try to measure the variables every week and try to figure out what is the highest probability. And I would think a low probability is those sanctions getting removed. We'll see what it means for that grain deal. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the recent results for March for the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. Some very, very interesting stuff that Canadian farmers are telling us at RealAgristudies. You're listening to RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
The next generation is the future of agriculture, but how do we launch from one role to leading? From succession planning and family dynamics to understanding finances and making the tough calls to discovering paths others have taken all through agriculture, the Successors Podcast covers it all. Tune in with me, your host, Kara Oosterhuis, simply by searching The Successors on your favorite podcast platform, or you can find it by visiting www.realagriculture.com.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
You're listening to RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM. Great to be here on Ralco Radio in Saskatchewan and wrapping up the week that was here in Canadian agriculture. You know, we were talking about the weather a little bit earlier. It just feels like spring's just a little bit elusive as you look out the door. And we've had, we actually got chances of snow in different parts of Western Canada next week continuing. So yeah, there is some nice days spotted in with some weather that feels a little bit more like March-ish. So we'll see what the back half of April leads to and how quickly all of a sudden it's like, hey, it's May and we're getting May weather. Definitely something that we're all watching out for as we want to get out to the fields and get a really strong start here to the 2023 growing season for sure. Okay, let's talk about the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. So what this is Real Agriculture's market research arm is called RealAgristudies in partnership with Justin Funk. And he teaches at Purdue. He's based out of Guelph, Ontario. And Justin and his father have a long career in market research in Canada. And we've partnered to form this, to create this Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. And what we're doing is we're asking farmers a number of different questions, repeated questions over a series of months to try to track their sentiment on a number of different issues, okay? And we've been doing this since September, and we just finished the March intake. And it's very, very fascinating what we've been seeing. And there's some things that I would say are concerning, and there's some things where it's like, okay, that makes sense. And I think we should, we can make some sense of it, and I think there's some positives from that. The one thing's for sure is that Canadian farmers in general are feeling decent, I think we should describe it as, in terms of their current farm financial performance. So what this is a scale from 0 to 200 and 100 being neutral, okay? And when we ask them about their current farm financial performance, they're at a 115. So Canadian farmers feeling slightly optimistic about their current farm financial performance. Now, when we get to future farm financial performance, that's where we see we're in negative territory at 87. So slightly negative sentiment when it comes to future farm financial performance. Now, since September, though, that indicator has been increasing every month. Okay, every other month we've done this survey. Back in September, That was only at a 74. So we feel more optimistic about the 12 months ahead today than we did about the 12 months ahead last September, which is interesting. Now, what's happened during that time period is we have definitely seen the markets fall off. Okay. So we've seen current farm financial performance stabilize at a time where, we've really seen a change in what's happened with some of the commodity markets like wheat and corn and canola and crops like that, right? You got a lot of questions on your marketing. Now we've seen beef prices go up substantially. So that's obviously a counterbalance to all of that. When we ask farmers about their confidence in marketing crops, now this is a measurement of the confidence that you have in your marketing strategy. This is about you. And farmers have moved from a 104 in September to now an 89. So you may look at that and you're like, we're negative sentiment and we're not feeling as good about our ability to market our crops in this environment. It's slightly down. That is much more stable than what we've seen when we ask farmers about their outlook on selling crops, which is their general feeling on the direction of the market, bullish or bearish. September, we were a very lofty 128. In March, we are 74, almost cut in half in terms of our sentiment towards the direction of the market going forward. If we connect that with how people feel about their future farm financial performance, which is relatively stable, and their current farm financial performance, which is in the positive, if we attach those, it just tells me very clearly that a lot of people feeling good about themselves financially and having some stability in it is the fact that we have seen input prices decline, fertilizer in particular. And that was much of the talk leading into the fall is what would happen with fertilizer? When should you buy it? Will we have enough? All those kinds of supply things we've been talking about. But the prices have gone down. And so to me, the reasonably good feeling about profitability, even with prices like canola and wheat dropping, people still feel pretty good about themselves financially. And the reality of that, I think, is all tied to inputs. Think about if you're a livestock producer, get relief in feed costs. Absolutely. Okay. If you are a crop producer, it's about fertilizer prices for sure. Now, if we add all of this together, okay, here's the biggest positive out of all of it, even with the volatility that's been in the market and how maybe people don't feel very positive about their optimism toward the Canadian ag economy. They're also not necessarily positive about the future of the Canadian ag industry on both of those. There's still a good reading when it comes to state of mental health. So what we ask producers is, in comparison to 12 months ago, is your mental health, better, same, or worse than it was 12 months ago? Okay. And we got an exactly neutral rating for the second survey in a row. So in January it was 100, and in March it's 100. I think that is a huge positive. So mental health unchanged compared to 12 months ago, even with the real drop that we have seen in the commodity market over that time period. I think that's a big positive. That's one of my reads on it. One of the other things that I'm very fascinated, and I talked about this on RealAg Radio earlier this week, is we also ask producers about their confidence in making farm investments. It's the lowest reading of all the things we asked about this month in March. Okay? So when it comes to your confidence in making farm investments, we are pretty well unchanged September of 22 through March of 23. We're in the 50s. So pretty negative when you look at it. Okay. It's a 52 right now. So farmers are not willing in this environment for a number of different reasons, I'm sure. Interest rates would be one, escalating costs would be another, just to name a few. Machinery is expensive, cost of building, construction's expensive. We know that land is expensive, right? So people have a lack of confidence that this is the right time to make that farm investment. And it really hasn't changed much since September. So my question is, what moves that number? What would the variables in this environment have to be in order for, instead of people saying it's a 52 out of 200, moving that to more of a neutral position? Is it some more sustained profitability? Is it interest rates going down? Because we've seen interest rates go up during the time period since the fall, and we really haven't seen that number go much lower. So it kind of tells me that that's not necessarily a factor. But maybe the relief, if interest rates in the back half of 23 were to somehow find a way to go lower, then maybe that moves the number higher. I'm not sure. I think it has a lot to do with profitability, to be honest with you. I think there's hangover. I still think there's hangover from the 21 drought. I do, particularly in places like Saskatchewan. And I think it's one of the reasons why future farm financial performance is not necessarily positive right now. Even though you could figure out, if we get average weather, even if you factor all that in, you can turn a profit. People are still cautious that the whole getting penalized for grain contracts. There's a hangover there, I think, that is still waiting. And I get that. That makes some sense. So if you're interested in finding out more about the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index that comes out from RealAgristudies, encourage you to go to RealAgristudies.com. We're doing surveys every month, surveys on issues, as well as we're doing this Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index every 2 months. So encourage you to become part of our panel. It is free. We give you a great report and analysis of the surveys that we're doing, and we'd appreciate it if you join. So go to RealAgristudies.com to hop in the fun there on the Insights panel. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the end of the single desk, because we got a new podcast launched at Real Agriculture, and it's talking all about that topic. And I know you have some passion about it. We're going to hit on that when we come back. You're listening to RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.
Want to get the best out of your soybean crops? Whether you've been growing them for a generation or are just starting into soybeans, find what you need to know at soybeanschool.com. You'll see videos on growing tips, pest control, and much more from specialists across the region, all in one place. Easy for you to access from your desktop, tablet, or mobile phone. Maximize your yields by staying up to date with the Soybean School, presented by BASF, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta Canada.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Back to Real Ag on the Weekend. It's been over 10 years since the end of the single desk in Canada, in Western Canada in particular, of course. And this is obviously a topic that carries a lot of passion for a number of people. They fought to keep it very strongly. For a number of people, they fought as their whole lives to get rid of it. It was generational opinions when it comes to whether the single desk was a benefit or a hindrance to Western Canadian farmers. Well, we've been doing this Ag Policy Connection podcast hosted by Kelvin Hepner. It is co-presented by Real Agriculture and CAPI. And we've had a lot of fun with it. It's been fantastic. Kelvin's done a great job covering a number of different ag policy issues. And what we do is then we come together and we talk about, the podcast that we heard with Tyler McCann of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, CAPI. And it's been really enjoyable. Some great feedback from the audience on these podcasts. We talked about the Canadian the ag policy framework. We've talked about BRM, the history of that. And this episode is all about the single desk, as I said. So Kelvin's guests were Aaron Gardner. He is now with Rubicon Strategy. Aaron was the chief of staff to former Agriculture Minister Jerry Ritz at the time of the board, that decision being made. And the other guest was David Hurley, who's host of the well-known Canadian political podcast, The Hurley Burley and The Curse of Politics. David's a longtime Liberal strategist who served as top advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Okay, he's also a professional pollster. So the Gandalf Group was hired to run the CWB's annual producer surveys back in the day. So I encourage you to check out this podcast. Go to realagriculture.com or wherever you get your podcasts. It's in our Real Agriculture main podcast feed. Encourage you to check it out and let us know how you feel about the discussion that happens. It's really behind the curtain kind of look, right? These are the people that were like on both sides of this issue in the room. Like, there's always like commentary as far as like, I believe this is what happened or why this person made the decision. And then there's the people that were actually in the room. And that's the opportunity for this episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. So, but what's interesting at RealAgristudies, we did last summer, it was the 10-year anniversary of the Canadian Wheat Board and the single desk going away. And we asked growers 10 years later a whole bunch of questions about the change. Okay. So this is a survey of 480 Western Canadian farmers. Okay. So it's a very good sample size. So we asked them, which of the following best describes your feelings toward the single desk being eliminated in 2012? So this is like how you felt at the time. 63% said I strongly supported the change. 14% said I was in support but uncertain of the change. 11% I did not support but could live with the change. 7% where I was very much against the change. And then there's a little bit less. Okay. So then what we asked 10 years later, which of the following best describes how you feel about the policy change now? 77% of respondents, 77, said it's been better than I expected. 17% said things are about the same, and 7% said it's been worse than I expected. Okay, so here, let's compare those two numbers. 10 years separating them. 63%. So that was the top number on 10 years ago. Strongly supported the change. Okay. So if you add that, the 14% of I was in support but uncertain, so those are the biggest, those are kind of the, like if you just take the 63, those are like the people that no matter what happens, I'm going to be in support. That number changed to 77% in terms of being better than I expected. So very, that's kind of really stands out to me. So if anybody's like, farmers still think that this is like a terrible decision, only 7% told us it's been worse than I expected. Seems like good decision making. For that small group of that were like I was very much against the change of 7%. What's interesting is that 16% of them said it's been better than I expected. So I thought that was an interesting piece of data as well. Another piece of interesting data from this is when we ask growers about the 10 years later, which of the following best describes how you feel about the policy change now? As you look at acres, it increases. So under 1,000 acres, 68% said it's been better than I expected. And as you move through the acre quadrants and you get to over 10,000, it's 81% believe it's been better than I expected. So interested to hear from you on this. Well, first of all, I want you to listen to the podcast. Kelvin does a great job. Ag Policy Connection podcast. You can find it at realagriculture.com. Encourage you to check it out. How do you feel about it? Let me know. I got the data here, but there's also your opinion on it. Do you feel a single desk would have helped you in a year like this? Would that, maybe in 2021 you wouldn't have got penalized in your contracts, I guess. But what about now? How do you feel about it here in 2023? And you can always send me that email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Or, of course, like I said, across all the different social media platforms. Or there always is the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. And one of the things I'd also like to hear from you is, what are some of those issues out there in farm country that you feel are really, really critical, and you feel that we got to get here on this show or any of the other coverage at realagriculture.com. Hey, speaking of that, on the weekend here, while you got some time, you're kicking back, waiting for spring to start, You could also go to RealAgriculture.com and check out all the content we can't squeeze into this show. Highly encourage you to do that. That's all the time we have for today's show here for Real Ag on the Weekend on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll chat again with you next week. Cheers, everybody.